Information in this video is derived from verified public sources. Full references and source links are provided in the description for review. On January 21st, 2026, in a private meeting room at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, something happened that most people didn't notice. President Donald Trump sat down with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. The meeting lasted 47 minutes. When they emerged, Trump announced what he called a framework of a future deal on Greenland. He smiled. Rutte smiled. The press took photos. Everyone moved on. But 3,000 miles away in Brussels, the European Parliament was holding an emergency session, and what they decided in that room on that same day will reshape global trade, geopolitics, and economic power for the next decade. The European Union officially suspended the agreement on reciprocal fair and balanced trade with the United States. This wasn't a minor policy adjustment. This was the complete freezing of a trade relationship worth $1.7 trillion annually. $1.7 trillion. That's larger than the entire economy of Canada. That's bigger than the gross domestic product of Russia and Australia combined. That's $4.4 billion changing hands between America and Europe every single day. And it stopped. Not because of economics, not because of tariffs or regulations or trade imbalances. It stopped because of an island covered in ice that 99% of Americans couldn't find on a map 2 months ago. Greenland. The deal that Trump just made with NATO isn't what the media is reporting. The framework he announced isn't about security cooperation or Arctic defense, it's about damage control. Because what happened in the 3 weeks before that Davos meeting was the closest the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has come to complete fracture since it was founded 75 years ago. And the fracture wasn't caused by Russia. It wasn't caused by China. It was caused by the President of the United States threatening to invade an ally's territory. And while Washington and Brussels were locked in this crisis, while NATO was on the verge of collapse, while $1.7 trillion in trade froze solid, someone else was watching very carefully. Beijing. Because what just happened is exactly what China has been waiting for. The thing they couldn't accomplish through military pressure or economic coercion or diplomatic maneuvering, Donald Trump just handed to them on a silver platter. The fracturing of the Western alliance. I'm going to show you exactly what happened. I'm going to walk you through the secret negotiations, the threats that were made behind closed doors, the trade deal that collapsed, and why this isn't just about Greenland or NATO or trade. This is about the end of the post-World War II order, and it happened faster than anyone thought possible. Let's start with the question nobody in the media is asking. Why Greenland? Why now? And why is Donald Trump willing to blow up 75 years of alliance over an island with 57,000 people and more polar bears than cars? The answer isn't what you think. This isn't about real estate. This isn't about ego. This is about rare earth minerals, military positioning, and a geographic choke point that controls access to the Arctic Ocean. And the person who understands this better than anyone is sitting in Beijing. Greenland is the world's largest island, 2.16 million square kilometers, 80% covered by an ice sheet. It belongs to Denmark. It has since 1721 when Denmark colonized it. The population is tiny, 57,000 people. Most of them are indigenous Inuit. The capital, Nuuk, has a population of 19,000. There are towns in rural America with more people. But beneath that ice, geologists have identified deposits of rare earth elements worth an estimated $1.5 trillion. Rare earths. The minerals that are essential for everything from smartphones to fighter jets to wind turbines to guided missiles. And right now, China controls 70% of global rare earth production. 70%. The United States is almost entirely dependent on China for the materials that build American military hardware. Greenland has the second largest rare earth deposit on the planet. Kvanefjeld in southern Greenland contains an estimated 2.9 million tons of rare earth oxides. If developed, it could supply 15% of global demand. That's enough to break China's monopoly. That's enough to make the United States independent of Beijing for critical defense materials. But there's more. Greenland sits at the geographic intersection of 3 critical military zones. To the west, North America. To the east, Europe. To the north, the Arctic Ocean. And the Arctic is melting. Climate change, regardless of your politics, is a fact. The ice is receding. And as the ice recedes, new shipping routes are opening. Routes that cut transit time between Asia and Europe by 40%. Routes that Russia is already exploiting. Routes that China wants access to desperately. The Northern Sea route along Russia's Arctic coast cuts the distance from Shanghai to Rotterdam by 3,000 nautical miles compared to going through the Suez Canal, 3,000 miles. At current shipping costs, that saves approximately $1 million per voyage for a large container ship. Multiply that across global trade volumes, and you're looking at tens of billions in annual savings. China knows this, Russia knows this, and now so does everyone else. The United States has one major military installation in Greenland, Patuffik Space Base, formerly known as Thule Air Base. It's located 750 miles north of the Arctic Circle. It's home to the 21st Space Wing, which operates early warning radar systems that detect incoming ballistic missiles. If Russia or China launches a nuclear strike at the United States, Patuffik detects it first. The base is essential to American missile defense. It's non-negotiable for United States national security. But here's the problem. Patuffik is on Danish soil. Greenland is a self-governing territory of Denmark. The United States operates the base under a treaty signed in 1951. Denmark can revoke that treaty. They haven't. They won't. But the fact that they could makes Washington nervous. Very nervous. And then there's China. In 2018, China declared itself a near-Arctic state. This is geographically absurd. China is 4,800 miles from the Arctic Circle. But Beijing doesn't care about geography. They care about access. They've been trying to invest in Greenland for over a decade. In 2016, a Chinese company offered to buy an old naval base in Greenland. Denmark blocked it. In 2018, Chinese state-owned enterprises offered to finance 3 new airports in Greenland. The United States pressured Denmark to reject the funding. Denmark agreed and paid for the airports themselves. China wants Greenland, not to own it. They're not stupid enough to try territorial acquisition. But they want mining rights, they want port access, they want a foothold in the Arctic, and every time they try, the United States blocks them. But blocking Chinese investment only works if Greenland stays aligned with Denmark and NATO. If that relationship fractures, if Greenland decides it wants independence, if they start looking for alternative partners, China is standing by with checkbook open. This is the context. This is why Trump wants Greenland. Not because he's irrational, because the strategic value is undeniable. The rare earths, the military position, the Arctic access. It's worth trillions in economic and security value. But wanting something and getting it are two very different things. And what Trump did to try to get it almost destroyed NATO. On January 7th, 2026, Donald Trump held a press conference at Mar-a-Lago. The topic was supposed to be domestic policy. Halfway through, a reporter asked about Greenland. Trump's answer shocked everyone in the room. He said, and I'm quoting directly from the transcript, "We need Greenland for economic security, for military security. I'm not going to rule out using military force or economic force. We have many tools, many very powerful tools, and if certain countries continue to obstruct what's clearly in everyone's interest, they'll find out what those tools are. Military force, against an ally, against a NATO member." The words hung in the air. The room went silent. Then the questions started. Clarifications, walkbacks, aides scrambling. But Trump doubled down. He said Denmark was being unreasonable. He said European leaders didn't understand modern security threats. He said Greenland's future was too important to be held hostage by outdated sovereignty concerns. The reaction in Europe was immediate and volcanic. Within 6 hours, the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, held her own press conference. She said, and I quote, "Greenland belongs to the people of Greenland. It is not for sale. It will never be for sale. Any attempt by any nation to use force against Danish territory would mean the immediate end of NATO as we know it." Read that again. The immediate end of NATO, the defensive alliance that has kept Europe and North America unified for 75 years, the cornerstone of Western security, over in one sentence. But Trump wasn't done. On January 17th, 2026, he escalated. He announced that if 8 specific European nations didn't publicly support negotiations on Greenland's future status, the United States would impose tariffs. 10% on all goods from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. 8 countries, 8 NATO allies. 10% tariffs. And not just symbolic tariffs. Real economic punishment targeting sectors where these countries had the most to lose. The announcement included a timeline. If the 8 countries didn't agree to negotiations within 30 days, the tariffs would increase to 25% by June 1st. If they still refused, Trump threatened complete trade suspension. He called it leverage. European leaders called it extortion. Let me give you the numbers so you understand what this meant. Annual United States imports from these 8 countries combined total approximately $450 billion. A 10% tariff would cost American consumers and businesses $45 billion annually in higher prices. But it would devastate European exporters. Germany alone exports $127 billion worth of goods to the United States every year. Automobiles, machinery, pharmaceuticals, chemicals. A 10% tariff would make German products less competitive against American and Asian alternatives. Tens of thousands of jobs would be at risk. Norway exports $64 billion in goods, mostly energy and fish. The Netherlands, $87 billion, much of it agricultural products and refined petroleum. France, $52 billion, including aircraft, wine, and luxury goods. The United Kingdom, $61 billion, Sweden, 15 billion. Denmark, 12 billion. Finland, 8 billion. Add it up, and you're looking at economic warfare against America's closest allies. Not adversaries, not competitors. Allies. Countries that stood with the United States through 2 world wars, the Cold War, the War on Terror, every major conflict of the past century. And Trump was threatening to economically punish them because they wouldn't negotiate away the sovereignty of one of their territories. The response was unprecedented. On January 19th, the foreign ministers of all 8 targeted countries held a joint press conference in Brussels. They issued a statement condemning the tariff threat as incompatible with NATO obligations, contrary to international law, and fundamentally destructive to the transatlantic relationship. They said the threatened tariffs violated World Trade Organization rules. They said if the United States proceeded, the European Union would file formal complaints and impose retaliatory tariffs on American goods. But more importantly, they drew a red line. The statement said, the territorial integrity of member states is non-negotiable. Any attempt to coerce changes to sovereign borders through economic or military threats represents a violation of the principles upon which NATO was founded. If such threats are carried out, member states will be forced to reconsider their participation in alliance structures. Reconsider their participation. That's diplomatic language for we might leave NATO, 8 countries, including Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. The 3 largest European economies. The 3 most powerful European militaries. If they left NATO, the alliance would cease to exist in any meaningful form. And this is where the trade deal comes in. Because while the tariff threats were making headlines, something much bigger was happening behind the scenes. The collapse of the economic framework that has governed United States-Europe trade for decades. I don't push memberships. If this content consistently helps you think more clearly about markets and global events, membership is simply a way to go deeper and support the channel. On August 14th, 2025, 5 months before the Greenland crisis erupted, President Trump and European Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen signed something called the Agreement on Reciprocal Fair and Balanced Trade. The media barely covered it. It seemed like a boring technical document. Tariff schedules, regulatory harmonization, market access provisions, the kind of thing that trade lawyers read and everyone else ignores. But this agreement was actually revolutionary. It was designed to create the largest free trade zone in human history. The United States and European Union combined represent a market of 850 million people with a combined gross domestic product of over $45 trillion. 45 trillion. That's 54% of global economic output. The agreement would reduce or eliminate tariffs on over 90% of goods traded between the 2 regions. It would harmonize regulations on everything from automobile safety standards to pharmaceutical approvals. It would open service sectors that had been protected for decades. The projected economic impact was staggering. The European Commission estimated the deal would increase United States-Europe trade by 32% within 5 years. That would add $550 billion to annual trade volumes. United States GDP would increase by an estimated 0.3% annually. Doesn't sound like much until you realize that's $69 billion per year in additional economic activity. The EU would see similar gains. Jobs would be created, hundreds of thousands of them. Manufacturing jobs as supply chains integrated, technology jobs as digital services expanded, agricultural jobs as farm products gained market access. The agreement was supposed to be the economic answer to China's Belt and Road Initiative, a way for democracies to create economic interdependence so deep that political conflicts would become impossible to sustain. The signing ceremony in August 2025 was held at the White House. Trump and von der Leyen stood at podiums. They talked about partnership. They talked about shared values. They talked about the strength of the transatlantic relationship. Trump called it the greatest trade deal in history. Von der Leyen called it a new chapter in United States-Europe cooperation. The agreement required ratification. In the United States, Congress needed to approve it. In the European Union, the European Parliament and all 27 member state parliaments needed to vote yes. The process was expected to take 12 to 18 months, but everyone assumed it would pass. The economic benefits were too obvious. The political momentum was too strong. This was happening. Then came Greenland, and everything fell apart. On January 21st, 2026, the same day Trump met with NATO Secretary General Rutte in Davos, the European Parliament held an extraordinary session. The topic was the tariff threats. The session was scheduled to last 2 hours. It lasted 7. Member after member stood up and spoke. German representatives talked about economic coercion being incompatible with alliance membership. French representatives talked about sovereignty being non-negotiable. Danish representatives, understandably, were the most vocal. One Danish member of parliament said, quote, "We cannot ratify a trade agreement with a country that threatens military action against European territory. We cannot integrate our economies with a partner that uses economic warfare as a diplomatic tool. This is not about Greenland anymore. This is about whether we can trust the United States to honor any agreement. The vote came at 11:43 p.m. Brussels time. The resolution was simple. It suspended all parliamentary action on the agreement on reciprocal, fair, and balanced trade until the United States government formally and unequivocally renounced the use of military or economic coercion against European Union member states or their territories. The vote was 573 in favor, 42 against, 37 abstentions. Not even close. The trade deal that would have created a $45 trillion integrated market died in one night. 7 months of negotiations. 2 years of preliminary discussions before that. Thousands of pages of regulatory text. All of it suspended indefinitely. But the European Parliament went further. They passed a second resolution. This one declared that if the United States imposed the threatened tariffs, the European Union would immediately implement retaliatory tariffs on $150 billion worth of American goods. The targets were chosen for maximum political impact. Bourbon whiskey from Kentucky, Mitch McConnell's home state, corn from Iowa, wheat from Kansas, oranges from Florida, timber from Oregon. The EU would hit products from swing states and states represented by key senators. Make it hurt politically, make it impossible for Congress to ignore. And they didn't stop there. The resolution authorized the European Commission to begin formal consultations with China on a potential comprehensive trade agreement. Read that sentence again. The European Union threatened to pivot toward Beijing if Washington followed through on the tariff threats. This is what collapsed, not just a trade agreement. The entire structure of economic cooperation that has defined the transatlantic relationship since World War II. $1.7 trillion in annual trade suddenly frozen in political ice. Let me give you the breakdown so you understand the scale. United States-European Union trade in goods totals approximately $750 billion annually. Trade in services adds another $950 billion. Combined, $1.7 trillion. That's $4.6 billion every single day. $4.6 billion. And on January 21st, it stopped growing. The expansion that the trade agreement would have created, the $550 billion in additional trade over 5 years, gone. The integrated supply chains canceled. The harmonized regulations dead. But the real number, the number that should terrify anyone paying attention, is $4.7 trillion. That's the total stock of foreign direct investment between the United States and European Union. American companies have invested $2.5 trillion in European businesses, real estate, and infrastructure. European companies have invested $2.2 trillion in America. These investments represent ownership stakes, factories, distribution networks, intellectual property, everything that makes modern global business function. And all of it is now at risk. Because if the political relationship fractures completely, if NATO dissolves, if the trade war escalates, those investments become liabilities. Companies start pulling back. They restructure supply chains. They relocate headquarters. They divest assets. The $4.7 trillion doesn't vanish overnight. But it starts to erode. And once that erosion starts, it accelerates. This is what Trump's Greenland obsession cost, not the island itself. He didn't get Greenland. What he got was the collapse of the economic architecture that has made the Western alliance the most powerful bloc in human history. So what was the secret deal that Trump announced in Davos? What did he and Mark Rutte actually agree to? And why did Trump back down from the tariff threats? The answer is complicated because the deal isn't actually a deal. It's a framework for future negotiations. That's diplomatic language, for we agree to keep talking and not blow everything up immediately. But even that required Trump to make concessions he never makes. Real, substantive concessions that show just how close NATO came to complete collapse. Here's what the framework includes, based on the joint statement released after the Davos meeting and subsequent reporting from NATO officials who spoke anonymously to the press. First, the United States formally renounced the use of military force regarding Greenland. This was explicit. The statement says, and I quote, "The United States reaffirms its commitment to the territorial integrity of all NATO member states and territories. Military force will not be considered as a tool for resolving questions of sovereignty or territorial status within the alliance." That's a climb down. A complete reversal from Trump's January 7th statement where he refused to rule out military force. He had to eat those words publicly. NATO demanded it. Denmark demanded it. And Trump, facing the real possibility that 8 countries would actually leave NATO, agreed. Second, the tariff threats were withdrawn. The framework doesn't mention this directly because it would be too embarrassing. But the day after the Davos announcement, the White House quietly issued a statement saying the tariff review had been postponed pending further consultations. Postponed indefinitely, according to European officials, which means cancelled. Third, and this is where it gets interesting, the framework establishes a NATO Arctic Security Initiative. This is the actual substance of the deal. The United States, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland will coordinate on Arctic defense. They'll increase military exercises in the region. They'll enhance intelligence sharing. They'll develop infrastructure for rapid deployment of forces to Arctic territories. But here's the key part. The initiative includes a commitment to develop rare earth mining in Greenland under NATO partnership frameworks. This is what Trump actually wanted. Access to Greenland's minerals. And he got it, sort of. Not through ownership, not through territorial acquisition, through partnership. NATO countries will invest in developing Greenland's rare earth deposits. The minerals will be shared among alliance members. Greenland gets the economic benefits. Denmark retains sovereignty. The United States gets the rare earths. China gets locked out. Fourth, the framework includes something called the Golden Dome Initiative. This is a proposed missile defense installation in northern Greenland. It would complement the existing radar at Patuxent Space Base. The system would provide 360-degree coverage of ballistic missile threats from Russia and China. The cost is estimated at $18 billion over 8 years. The United States will pay 60%. NATO countries will cover the rest through burden-sharing arrangements. Fifth, and this is the part that matters most to Denmark and Greenland, the framework explicitly states that all security arrangements are subject to Greenlandic consent. Greenland's parliament has to approve any military installations. They have to approve mining agreements. They retain veto power. This is critical because Greenland has been moving toward independence for years. They have a referendum scheduled for 2028 on full sovereignty from Denmark. If Greenland votes yes, they become an independent country. And if they're independent, they're not automatically part of NATO. They'd have to apply for membership separately. The framework addresses this by saying that regardless of Greenland's future political status, the security arrangements will be honored as long as Greenland agrees. It's essentially NATO acknowledging that Greenland might become independent and trying to lock in the relationship now before that happens. Sixth, the framework includes a provision that European officials insisted on. Any country that attempts to pressure NATO members on territorial issues through economic or military coercion will face collective response. This is aimed directly at Trump. It's a warning. If you try this again, if you threaten allies again, the entire alliance will respond as one. So this is the deal. The United States gets enhanced Arctic security, access to rare earth minerals, and expanded military presence in Greenland, but not through ownership, through partnership. And Denmark and Greenland get security guarantees, economic investment, infrastructure development, and most importantly, a formal acknowledgement of Greenlandic sovereignty and self-determination. Trump spun this as a win. He said the framework achieves everything he wanted without compromising anyone's sovereignty. And technically, he's right. The United States gets the strategic benefits, but it's not what he originally demanded. He wanted control. He wanted ownership. He threatened military force to get it. And what he actually got was a partnership agreement that requires consensus and gives Greenland veto power. That's not a Trump-style deal. That's a compromise. And the fact that Trump agreed to it shows how serious the NATO crisis actually was. Because Trump doesn't compromise unless he has no other choice. Now let's talk about the winner in all of this, because it's not the United States, it's not Europe, it's not even Greenland, it's China. On January 22nd, 2026, the day after the Davos framework was announced and the European Parliament suspended the trade deal, a curious thing happened in Beijing. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs held a routine press conference. A reporter asked about the Greenland situation. The spokesperson gave a carefully worded answer. She said, quote, "China has always respected the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations. We believe disputes should be resolved through dialogue and mutual respect. We hope all parties can work together to maintain regional peace and stability." Standard diplomatic boilerplate, nothing controversial. But then she added one more sentence. "China remains committed to developing friendly cooperation with all Arctic nations and peoples based on mutual benefit and respect for sovereignty." Well, that last sentence is the key. All Arctic nations and peoples. Not governments, peoples. That's a signal. China is saying they're willing to work with Greenland directly, regardless of its political status. If Greenland becomes independent, if the relationship with Denmark changes, if NATO security arrangements fall apart, China is positioning itself as an alternative partner. And they're not doing this quietly. 3 days after the Davos meeting, the Chinese state-owned enterprise China Northern Rare Earth Group announced a new initiative. They're offering technical assistance and financing to any country that wants to develop rare earth mining capabilities. The program is called the Rare Earth Partnership Initiative. It offers low-interest loans, technology transfer, and guaranteed purchase agreements for refined rare earth elements. The target audience is obvious: countries with rare earth deposits that don't have the capital or expertise to develop them alone. Countries like Greenland, Mongolia, Vietnam, Brazil, Australia, African nations with untapped mineral wealth, China is offering to help develop these resources, and in exchange, they want long-term supply agreements and strategic partnerships. This is the Belt and Road playbook applied to critical minerals. Offer financing that countries can't refuse. Help them build infrastructure, create dependencies, then leverage those dependencies for political concessions. But China's gains go far beyond rare earths. What happened in January 2026 gave Beijing something much more valuable, proof that the Western alliance is fragile. Think about this from China's perspective. For 75 years, the biggest obstacle to Chinese global ambition has been NATO, not the military alliance itself, the unity. The fact that the United States, Canada, and Europe act as one bloc on major international issues. When China pressures Taiwan, NATO countries coordinate their response. When China tries to buy strategic infrastructure in Europe, NATO countries consult and collectively block it. When China pushes territorial claims in the South China Sea, NATO countries sail joint freedom of navigation operations. This unity is what makes NATO powerful, not the tanks or planes or ships. The coordination, the trust, the shared commitment to mutual defense and common interests. And Trump just shattered it, not permanently. The framework deal papered over the immediate crisis, but the cracks are visible. European leaders now know that the United States, under certain leadership, will threaten them, will use economic coercion, will prioritize unilateral interests over alliance solidarity. That knowledge changes everything. European strategic planners are now building contingencies for a future where the United States can't be trusted. They're discussing European strategic autonomy. They're talking about independent defense capabilities. They're exploring closer coordination with each other, separate from NATO structures. And every step toward European autonomy is a step away from transatlantic unity, which is exactly what China wants. Let me show you how this plays out in practical terms. France is already calling for an independent European nuclear deterrent, not replacing NATO, supplementing it. But once you build independent capabilities, you start using them independently. You make decisions without Washington. You pursue interests that might diverge from American priorities. Germany is pushing for a European defense industry that doesn't rely on American technology. They want European fighter jets, European tanks, European missile systems. Again, this is framed as strengthening NATO, but it's also creating the capability to act without American approval or support. The European Union is developing its own security strategy for the Indo-Pacific. They're sending warships to the South China Sea on European missions, not NATO operations. They're building diplomatic relationships with Asian countries independent of American frameworks. None of this is anti-American. European leaders will tell you repeatedly that they value the transatlantic partnership. But they're also hedging. They're preparing for a world where that partnership might not be reliable, and that hedging creates opportunities for China. Here's a specific example. In December 2025, before the Greenland crisis, the European Union was negotiating a comprehensive investment agreement with China. The negotiations had stalled over human rights concerns and market access issues. European countries were united in demanding concessions from Beijing before signing. After the Greenland crisis, after the trade deal suspension, those negotiations restarted with a different tone. European officials are now more willing to compromise, not because they care less about human rights, because they need alternatives to American trade. If the transatlantic economic relationship is unstable, Europe needs other markets. And the biggest market available is China. China didn't cause the Greenland crisis. They didn't plan it, but they're absolutely capitalizing on it. Every division within NATO is an opportunity for Beijing to expand influence, and the divisions just got a lot wider. The European Union's threat to negotiate a comprehensive trade agreement with China wasn't empty posturing. According to officials involved in the discussions, preliminary talks began on January 26th, just 5 days after the trade deal suspension. The framework under discussion would increase EU-China trade by an estimated $200 billion over 5 years. Not as large as the United States-Europe deal would have been, but substantial. And it comes with strings. China is demanding that Europe remain neutral on Taiwan, not abandon the One China policy. Just stop participating in freedom of navigation operations near Taiwan. Stop selling defense technology to Taipei. Stay neutral. Before the Greenland crisis, every European country would have rejected that demand immediately. After the crisis, some are reconsidering. If the United States is willing to threaten European allies over Greenland, why should Europe risk Chinese economic retaliation to defend American interests in Taiwan? That's the question European leaders are quietly asking. And the fact that they're asking it represents a strategic victory for China worth far more than any trade deal or rare earth deposit. Let me zoom out and show you the bigger pattern here. Because Greenland isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a trend that should terrify anyone who understands how global power actually works. Since 2022, we've seen a systematic weakening of Western institutional cohesion, not through external attack, through internal dysfunction, and the pattern is always the same. Step 1. A crisis emerges that requires coordinated response. Ukraine war, Middle East conflicts, Chinese aggression, supply chain disruptions. Pandemic threats. Pick your crisis. Step 2. The United States either takes unilateral action without consulting allies or makes demands that allies find unacceptable. Step 3. Allies push back. They object. They refuse. They assert their own interests. Step 4. Instead of negotiating or compromising, the United States threatens consequences, economic punishment, reduced security commitments, public criticism. Step 5. The crisis escalates to the point where the entire alliance structure is at risk. Step 6. A face-saving compromise is reached that resolves the immediate problem but doesn't repair the underlying damage. We saw this pattern with Ukraine. The United States wanted Europe to cut energy ties with Russia completely and immediately. Europe said that would crash their economies. The United States accused Europe of funding Russian aggression. Europe accused the United States of demanding sacrifices it wouldn't make itself. Eventually, they compromised on phased energy reductions. But the mutual resentment remained. We saw it with China tariffs. The United States imposed tariffs on Chinese goods and demanded Europe do the same. Europe said the tariffs violated WTO rules and would trigger retaliation that would hurt European exporters. The United States said Europe was being weak on China. Europe said the United States was pursuing protectionism disguised as security policy. They never fully aligned. We saw it with defense spending. The United States demanded NATO countries spend at least 2% of GDP on defense. Most countries weren't meeting that target. The United States threatened to reduce its NATO commitment. European countries increased spending but resented being pressured. The target was met, but the relationship was strained, and now we're seeing it with Greenland. The pattern plays out the same way every time. United States demands, allies resist, United States threatens, crisis escalates, compromise reached, damage done. The problem is that each cycle weakens the alliance a little more. Trust erodes, coordination becomes harder, countries start hedging, they build alternative relationships. They prepare for a future where the alliance might not exist. And this erosion is exactly what China's grand strategy depends on. China cannot defeat the United States militarily. Not now, maybe not ever. The United States military is too powerful, too technologically advanced, too geographically advantaged. Direct military confrontation with the United States would be national suicide for China. But China doesn't need to defeat the United States militarily. They just need to break American alliances. Because the United States without allies is manageable. The United States military can project power globally, but it depends on bases in allied countries. Naval bases in Japan and South Korea, air bases in Germany and the United Kingdom, forward operating positions in Qatar and Australia. Without allied basing rights, American power projection collapses. The United States economy is massive, but it depends on global supply chains that run through allied ports, allied factories, allied logistics networks. Without allies, American companies can't access the markets and resources they need to remain competitive. The United States technology sector dominates globally, but it depends on allied research partnerships, allied talent pools, allied market access. Without allies, American innovation slows. China understands this completely. Their strategy isn't to fight the United States. It's to isolate the United States, and the best way to achieve that isolation is to wait for the United States to alienate its own allies, which is exactly what's happening, not through Chinese action, through American dysfunction. Let me give you a Chinese strategic document that explains this explicitly. In 2021, a research institute affiliated with China's Central Party School published a report called Long-Term Competition with the United States, Strategic Patience and Systemic Advantage. The report is not secret. It's publicly available in Chinese with unofficial English translations circulating in academic and policy circles. The report argues that China should avoid direct confrontation with the United States. Instead, China should focus on 3 objectives. First, maintain economic growth to build comprehensive national power. Second, expand global partnerships to create alternative poles of power. Third, wait for internal contradictions in the American alliance system to deepen. The report specifically identifies NATO as the critical vulnerability. It says, and I'm translating from the Chinese, the North Atlantic Alliance is bound by shared interests, but divided by conflicting priorities. As American power becomes more unilateral and less consultative, European partners will seek greater autonomy. This autonomy will create space for Chinese engagement with individual European states, undermining coordinated containment efforts. That was written in 2021, 3 years before the Greenland crisis, and it describes exactly what's happening now. So what does all of this mean for your life? For your job, your savings, your future? Because this isn't just geopolitics. This affects you directly. First, trade disruption means higher prices. The suspension of the United States-Europe trade deal means tariffs stay in place that would have been reduced or eliminated. Those tariffs get passed on to consumers. European wine, cheese, automobiles, machinery all cost more because of tariff burdens. American exports to Europe face the same problem. The cost of doing business across the Atlantic just went up, and you pay for it. Second, investment uncertainty means slower growth. The $4.7 trillion in mutual United States-Europe investments represents real economic activity. Factories, offices, distribution centers, research facilities. When political relationships become unstable, companies delay new investments. They postpone expansion plans. They wait to see if the situation stabilizes. That delay means fewer jobs created, slower wage growth, reduced economic opportunity. Third, alliance instability means higher defense costs. If NATO weakens, if European countries decide they need independent defense capabilities, if the United States has to maintain larger military forces to compensate for reduced allied contributions, defense spending goes up. That's taxpayer money, your money, going to military budgets instead of infrastructure, education, healthcare, or tax cuts. Fourth, Chinese economic expansion means strategic dependency. If Europe pivots toward China for trade, if supply chains shift toward Beijing, if critical industries become reliant on Chinese markets, the United States loses leverage. And when America loses leverage, China gains it. That affects everything from technology standards to human rights enforcement to climate policy. If China can threaten economic consequences for countries that oppose its interests, those countries back down. The world becomes more authoritarian, less free, less aligned with American values. Fifth, rare earth access uncertainty means technology vulnerability. If the Greenland rare earth deal doesn't work out, if China maintains its monopoly on critical minerals, American companies remain dependent on Chinese supply for advanced manufacturing. That dependency gives China veto power over American technology development. It means China can cut off supply during conflicts. It means American defense contractors depend on Chinese materials to build American weapons. That's a national security nightmare. Here's what you should actually do with this information. Not panic, not assume the worst, but prepare for a more volatile global environment. Diversify your investments. If you're heavily exposed to European stocks or United States companies that depend on European markets, consider rebalancing. Not abandoning those positions, just reducing concentration risk. Monitor your job sector. If you work in industries heavily dependent on transatlantic trade, automotive, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, agriculture, pay attention to trade policy developments. Understand how tariff changes could affect your employer. Have contingency plans. Build savings. Economic volatility means unexpected disruptions. Job losses, market crashes, supply chain breakdowns. Having 6 to 12 months of expenses and liquid savings gives you a buffer when things get unstable. Stay informed but skeptical. The media will tell you this is all fine or it's all disaster. Neither is true. The situation is serious but manageable. Alliances are under stress but not broken. Economic relationships are strained but not severed. Don't panic, but don't ignore it either. Engage politically. This is fundamentally a political problem. The decisions leaders make about alliances, trade, and foreign policy affect your economic future. If you care about American prosperity and security, you should care about these relationships. Vote for leaders who understand the value of alliances. Support policies that strengthen rather than fracture international cooperation. Here's where we are. January 26, 2026. The immediate Greenland crisis has been diffused. The NATO framework deal papering over the worst tensions. The tariff threats withdrawn. The trade deal suspended but not dead. Everything on pause. But pause isn't resolution. The underlying dynamics haven't changed. Trump still wants greater control over Greenland. Europe still considers sovereignty non-negotiable. China still sees opportunity in Western division. The conditions that created the crisis still exist. So what happens next? There are 3 possible paths forward, and the path we take will define the next decade of global politics. Path 1, the reconciliation scenario. United States and European leaders use the breathing room from the framework deal to actually rebuild trust. They restart negotiations on the trade agreement. They address European concerns about unilateral American actions. They create formal consultation mechanisms so future disputes get resolved before they explode into crises. The NATO Arctic Security Initiative becomes a model for cooperation. Greenland's rare earths get developed through partnership. China gets locked out of Arctic resources. The Western Alliance emerges stronger and more unified. This is possible. It's not likely, but it's possible. It requires leadership on both sides willing to prioritize alliance unity over short-term political wins. It requires compromise. It requires patience. It requires acknowledging that alliances are built on mutual benefit, not coercion. Path 2, the muddle-through scenario. The situation stays frozen. The trade deal remains suspended but not formally canceled. Security cooperation continues at reduced levels. The United States and Europe coordinate on some issues but not others. The relationship becomes transactional rather than strategic. Partners, but not allies. This is probably the most likely outcome in the near term. Nobody wants to formally break the alliance, but nobody trusts it enough to deepen it either. The problem with muddling through is that it's inherently unstable. Every new crisis becomes another test. Every disagreement risks escalation, and over time the relationship degrades. Countries build alternative partnerships. They hedge more, they coordinate less. The alliance doesn't collapse in one dramatic moment. It just slowly becomes irrelevant. Path 3, the fracture scenario. Another crisis emerges. Taiwan, Ukraine, Middle East, trade, whatever. The United States makes unilateral demands again. Europe refuses again. But this time, the compromise doesn't come. Positions harden. Rhetoric escalates. Economic warfare begins for real. Countries start leaving NATO, not all at once. One or two at first, then more. The alliance fragments. This is the worst case, but it's not unthinkable. It almost happened over Greenland. If Trump had actually imposed those tariffs, if European countries had followed through on their threats to reconsider NATO participation, the alliance would have entered a death spiral. It was that close. And if it happens once, it can happen again. The precedent has been set. European leaders now know that the United States, under certain leadership, will threaten them. That knowledge doesn't go away. It shapes future decisions. It makes fracture more likely, not less. And which path we take depends on choices being made right now. Not by you or me, by leaders in Washington, Brussels, Copenhagen, Beijing. Their decisions will determine whether the Western alliance survives the 21st century or becomes a historical footnote. Let me bring this full circle. On January 21st, 2026, a trade relationship worth $1.7 trillion froze solid because of an argument over an island covered in ice. The agreement on reciprocal fair and balanced trade, the framework that would have created the largest economic bloc in human history, got suspended. Not because of economics, because of threats, coercion, and the fracturing of trust between allies. Trump got his framework deal on Greenland, but he didn't get what he wanted. He got a partnership agreement that requires consultation, gives veto power to a government of 57,000 people. He withdrew his tariff threats. He backed down. Europe suspended the trade deal. They drew red lines. They coordinated their response. They showed they wouldn't be bullied. But they also revealed divisions. They admitted dependence on American trade. They showed vulnerability. And China watched all of it. They didn't cause the crisis, but they benefited from it. Every crack in NATO is an opportunity for Beijing. Every moment of Western disunity is a step toward Chinese strategic advantage. The Greenland crisis is over, for now, but the pattern that created it continues. And the next crisis is already forming somewhere. Maybe it's Taiwan, maybe it's Ukraine, maybe it's something we haven't imagined yet. What we know is this. The alliances that kept the democratic world safe and prosperous for 75 years are under stress like never before. Not from external enemies, from internal dysfunction. And if those alliances break, if that coordination ends, if that unity fractures, the world that emerges will be more dangerous, more authoritarian, less free, for everyone. The question is whether we recognize that reality before it's too late. Whether leaders choose alliance over ego, cooperation over coercion, long-term stability over short-term political wins. The Greenland crisis gave us a glimpse of what happens when those choices go wrong. $1.7 trillion in trade frozen. NATO on the brink, China gaining strategic advantage without firing a shot. If this has been valuable, if you want to understand these developments as they unfold, subscribe to this channel right now, hit the notification bell. Because this story isn't over. The framework deal bought time. It didn't solve the underlying problems. And when the next crisis hits, you'll want to see it coming. The secret Greenland deal just froze Europe's $1.7 trillion trade alliance, while China benefits from the chaos. The warning has been given. The pattern is clear. The only question is whether anyone is listening.